I've always been a night owl. It's something about the stillness of the night that comforts me, the way the world seems to hold its breath while I stay awake, lost in my thoughts. That night was no different, or at least, it started that way. It was the summer of 2018, and I was living in a small apartment on the outskirts of town. It was an older building, with creaky floors and thin walls, but I didn't mind. Rent was cheap, and it was close enough to my job at the local diner. It was around 2 a.m. when I decided to take a break from binge watching some random series on Netflix. I needed fresh air and a change of scenery, so I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. It was a quiet area, and I felt safe wandering the streets even at that hour. As I stepped outside, the cool night air greeted me, refreshing and invigorating. I walked down the familiar path, past the small park with the rusty swing set, and towards the old cemetery that sat at the edge of the neighborhood. The cemetery was one of those places that always seemed a little spooky at night, but during the day, it was a peaceful spot where kids played and people walked their dogs. I don't know what compelled me to enter the cemetery that night. Maybe it was curiosity, or perhaps a subconscious desire to confront my fears. Either way, I found myself pushing open the wrought iron gate and stepping onto the gravel path that wound through the headstones. The moonlight cast eerie shadows, and the trees whispered softly in the breeze. I walked slowly, reading the names and dates on the headstones, some of which dated back over a century. It was oddly calming, this reminder of mortality and the passage of time. I was about halfway through the cemetery when I saw him, a man, standing by a grave, wearing a dark green hat. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. He didn't seem to notice me at first, and I considered turning back, but something about him intrigued me. I decided to approach him, thinking perhaps he was visiting a loved one. "Good evening," I said softly as I got closer. He didn't respond. I took a few more steps and tried again. "Is everything okay?" This time, he turned his head slightly, enough for me to see the faint outline of his features. His eyes, however, remained hidden in shadow. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. The question caught me off guard. I just needed some fresh air. "What about you?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned back to the grave he was standing by, and I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The headstone was blank. No name, no dates, nothing. "Who are you?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. He slowly lifted his head, and I saw his eyes for the first time. They were empty, hollow sockets staring back at me. I froze in terror, unable to move or speak. "Leave," he whispered, his voice echoing in my mind. "Leave and never come back." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't stop until I was back at my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it tightly. I collapsed onto my couch, trembling and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The next day, I went back to the cemetery in the daylight, determined to prove to myself that it had all been a bad dream. But when I reached the spot where the man had stood, I found the blank headstone just as I'd seen it. I asked the groundskeeper about it, and he told me it had been there for as long as he could remember, though no one knew why it was left blank. I moved out of that apartment a few months later, and I've never been back to that cemetery. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone with my thoughts, I can still see those hollow eyes staring back at me, and I hear his whisper, "Leave and never come back." To this day, I don't know who or what he was, but one thing is for sure, let's not meet again.